Welcome to Georgie's Stripping the Dipping. You're joined by your normal co-host, Denzel Clarkson, and we hope that all of our listeners around the world are keeping well and having a great start to the week in the lead up of race week for Imola. And as we know, there have been many successful Johns in F1. We've had John Surtees, the legendary driver, to be the only one to win an F1 championship and a motorcycle championship simultaneously. We've had John Bernard, the innovator of the semi-automatic gearbox for Ferrari. But today, I want you guys to give us a huge standing ovation and also please shout out our guest today, John, the angry engineer. John, how are you keeping today?
I'm very good, thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. I feel a bit like an imposter being compared to John Surtees and John Barnard, if I'm honest.
Don't worry, we put you in the same bracket there, man. So no, it's excellent to have you on today as well. I know that Georgina as well was super excited to have you on because of your level of expertise and the background you have. So without further ado, could you please give our listeners just a breakdown of what you do, John?
Yeah, of course. I currently work in the automotive industry, and my work consists of designing uh, brake components for your high-end road cars. So that's down to the calipers and the brakes, but also like the automatic systems that make sure that they work when they're supposed to. Even to the extent of the adaptive cruise control and how the messages get received from that system to then apply the brakes. My background, I've worked in F1 for about a year and a half, very early in my career. That was about 10 years ago, though, so I can't really say much with authority these days. Um, but I do know a little bit about kind of how teams work and some of the engineering processes, which I'm sure that we're going to be talking about today.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, you touched you got the nail on the head right there, and there's so many different aspects of it, and also a really unique kind of background as well, John. It's fascinating to kind of see that you've got the automotive experience, but then also the engineering side, working with Formula One. And even if you just isolate it to brakes, there's been like quite a few revolutions with that over the years, with like the brake-by-wire system we have with these hybrid cars, and then also probably if you go way earlier, like probably in the 50s, they're using drum brakes, and now we have these carbon ceramic brakes, which often, are the leading edge of high performance and help these cars like decelerate from high speeds almost to nothing in such a short period of time. So it's really fascinating. Okay, we'll get into the questioning, and Georgina, I think, would like us to open this up with this one. So essentially all the cars have been struggling a bit with the weight as we've moved into this new season. And if we take out, like, let's say the 80 kilogram kind of weight limit for the drivers, um, we look at things like the bigger wheels, the tires, and also as well the power units and just other kind of parts of the regulations that have basically symptomatically increased the weight. How is it that F1 teams go about essentially reducing this, either via components? And what would you say is the most cost-effective way of them doing this?
Okay, so there's every part of the car is something that they can look into unless it's a spec component from Formula One or the FIA. So, for example, the wheels, obviously, they can't do anything with. The safety structures, the survival cell, obviously, there's minimum requirements for that. Um, but pretty much everything else you could play around with. Um, Now, some teams might have inherent advantages from last year. As much as the cars are changed, for example, you've got the engines. And, we've seen that Renault with their engine have gone for the split turbo this year, which seems to be giving them a good performance boost relative to the grid. But that will come with a compromise on the weight side because you've got, a bit more components, you've got extra bearings and a longer shaft as the turbo is split. So there's little small details like that, which obviously they all add up. And some of the teams in previous years, they may have had more opportunity to focus on some elements within the um, skeleton of the car, I guess, um, to lighten or to optimize, to just make them work a little bit nicer within their package and reduce the weight. Another example, I guess, would be the rear differential. If you have a lightened housing, even if it's only half a kilo less than your competitors, that's actually a massive difference. And I think that again, there will be some teams maybe further down the grid that when they weren't looking so heavily into 2020, and then obviously last year's regulations as it was frozen, they perhaps were spending more time on optimizing what they have within the car to keep the weight down. And we've seen that Alfa Romeo seem to be one of the teams that are particularly on it with the weight side of things. We've seen Haas move up the grid fairly successfully. And I'm hoping that the showing in Australia was more of a blip for them.
Sure.
But yeah, there's literally anything that they can do. Changing materials, you can, against the budget, you might prefer to 3D print something or just use a cheaper material, but on the same side, that could then add weight. So it's all a trade-off of performance versus cost, whether that's financial or in weight. And the teams will know kind of where they can and can't make these marginal gains, even if it's only a couple of 100 grams here and there.
Absolutely. No, I agree with you on that. And it is interesting to see kind of what routes they take and also kind of where they want to kind of remove the weight as well. Because I guess in a way, if you've got like a very loose rear end with like probably less downforce being produced in certain areas, you can maybe move the weight across in certain areas. So you have like a weight ballast or damper of such in a way to affect the way that the balance of the car is as well. But then also in relation to like the cost and effects of it as well, John. I think a couple of years ago we had this like tobacco between it was like Force India or Racing Point at the time and Mercedes with their copycat car, and one of the biggest things to come out of that was like the brake ducts and whether or not that should have been a listed part or not a listed part, and essentially whether they were allowed to copy that design from Mercedes. Just your thoughts, just from an engineering point of view, John. Like for the sake of like cost saving and stuff like that, do you think the teams should be able to like, if let's say for example a bigger manufacturer like Mercedes or Works team designs like a particular brake duct, do you think that the FIA maybe should look into having a system where teams can buy those parts of the design as well for their brakes, or in the sense and essence of Formula One being the team that creates the best formula, or is it probably best that it's just that every team like has their own kind of like way of making the brake ducts and such, and they shouldn't have like a system where like customer teams can buy certain parts which might be unique to a manufacturer or works team?
Um, that's a good question. I think, well, I know that there is the system in place that you can purchase either the designs or the physical components on some parts of the car, and there it's a limit to how much you can get. So we all saw that when Haas first entered F1, and everyone was throwing around the accusations of being the Ferrari B team.
Mm-hmm.
And they've shared wind tunnel resources over the years. They've shared common parts as well, which has all been within the guidelines and the framework of F1. So I'm not going to start throwing around any wild accusations or anything like that. But I think that is, I think it's a good balance that F1 has on that front. To be honest, that you can supply or procure components between two teams, but we're not kind of homogenizing it to the extent that, say, NASCAR is, where they are essentially all the same.
Yeah, it's like a spec series of such.
Yeah. So it's these areas are the marginal gains, the marginal engineering differences, which can be the difference between your cars running on the eighth row of the grid or the second row of the grid.
Mhm.
So there will be teams that will decide that buying some components is worth it to them, to spare them the effort and the resources and the time that goes into that, or to designing their own. Um, but there will be also the trade off of, do they think they can design something themselves that would be better? Now, teams like Red Bull, um, McLaren, for example, they will be predominantly trying to design everything, um, rather than procuring anything, because they know that they've got these guys, they've got big enough teams, and they're all, the top end of the profession, and they will be confident that their guys can come up with the best solutions. Now,
Sure.
they're not always spot on. Every team has their struggles, and they will have their weak points or go in the direction that's not the optimal. But yeah, I think the balance is good. That there's the opportunity there to get items without, um, making all the cards the same.
That's true, yeah, and absolutely. And I think that was probably one of the biggest fears for all of us, even when we had kind of got the kind of preview teasers from the FIA and Liberty Media and FOM with kind of what was the generic kind of 2022 car. We are like, wow, like the car just basically looks like a NASCAR, because oh, not NASCAR, sorry. Wow, imagine if Formula One cars look like NASCARs, that'd be cool. But no, it looks something like an Indy car with like these big front wing with large surface area and a lot more simplified barge boards and stuff like that as well. And like you correctly mentioned, it's nice that all the teams still have like a unique identity. And even if you look at two sister teams, for example, Red Bull and AlphaTauri, the cars share some similar design language, but there's still unique parts for the AlphaTauri, and then slightly different design language for the Red Bull, which is more predominantly developed by Adrian Newey. So yeah, absolutely agree with you on that one, and I think that was a very solid answer too. So to bring us on to another question, then, John, one other theme that we've been seeing so far in the season is certain teams suffering with reliability issues, even so early on. We had Alonso suffering with some hydraulic failures in qualifying in Australia, and also some overheating issue, it seemed, in Jeddah. And then also Max retiring of 2 out of the 3 races so far. Question is, John, why are we seeing this trend so earlier on in the season? And is it a bigger concern, considering that with a lot of the parts, you can only have 3 of them before you incur a penalty?
Yeah, it will be a concern, especially for a couple of teams on the grid, or a couple of power unit providers, perhaps I should say. For me, the reliability stuff is actually one of the more interesting sides of Formula One. As a bit of a tech geek, I think this year is going to be really interesting when it comes to reliability. It's the first year of new regulations, so it's always going to be fascinating to see the differences in designs and the strengths and weaknesses of the different cars. But the engines this year, I think, are going to be a much bigger factor than a lot of people realize or give credit for. For a start, we've had the engine freeze from the 1st of March, and that is for the ICE, the turbo, MGUH, engine oil, exhausts, and the fuel specs. So they're now all fixed for the rest of the year. And if an engine supplier, let's say Renault or Red Bull powertrains being the obvious 2 examples based on the first 3 races, if they need to update something for reliability, they can. But it can be often the case where you put in a reliability update and you actually lose performance.
Mm-hmm.
So if they're already having to take engine penalties for changing units because of the ones that have died this year already, then they might be wondering whether they actually want to make that trade off or just accept the penalties. And maybe they were just unlucky with their first couple of engines. It's going to be a really interesting game and a really interesting year for that, especially then when you factor in the new fuel as well, because that then changes the parameters. That changes kind of how much power that you're getting out of the fuel, what your flow rates are going to be to produce the performance that you want, and therefore how much fuel that you actually want to have on board. Because the cars don't always start the race with a full tank. They'll all have slightly different rates, so different amounts of fuel in the car at the start of the race, depending on their strategy. So, for example, if you've got, let's say, Perez starting on hards from further back in the grid, you might want to give him a bit less fuel, which will be easier on the tires and make them last longer. And then he can pit later, go on for softs instead of mediums, and he can be much faster at the end of the race. But with the change of fuels, that's then changing what their calculations are. And there's a possibility that we're going to see miscalculations this year. There could be, I guess, failures, a little bit like we saw in Australia. I think Verstappen's car. I haven't actually seen what the ultimate cause was declared to be, but I heard it was a fuel leak. So that could be caused by the higher ethanol content, because it is more harsh on soft components like your rubber hoses or your O-rings and gaskets.
Sure.
So yeah, I think this year is going to be fascinating with reliabilities, and I don't think there's going to be any team on the grid that won't have at least one kind of mechanical DNF this season.
Sure, and I definitely agree with you. I think that it's definitely a huge, well, kind of, I wouldn't say obstacle to racing, but it definitely seems to be more prominent this year than it has in previous years, I guess, with all of the tweaks and regulation changes we've had. And no doubt as well, we've seen a lot of drivers being told over the radio that, whilst the cars can physically follow each other a lot more, it's still not like conducive to the engine life when they're still like behind another car in the hot turbulent air, and that overheats their engine and causes a loss of performance there too. And I think, John, I'm pretty sure you've got a crystal ball there because you've actually, in a way, segued into another question that we had lined up. You mentioned how the fuel element could also cause a reliability issue, or maybe even a miscalculation and stop like drivers being able to finish the race. The
Yeah.
question is, John, is what's the deal with this new E10 fuel? What is it, and how does it really affect the cars and the way they perform?
Right. Okay. So the new fuel is E10, which means that it should have an ethanol content of 10%, which is up from 5.75%, which was what F1 was running last year. Ethanol is less energy dense than standard petrol or gasoline. Per unit volume. So, for example, if you take a liter of ethanol and a liter of pure petrol and you set fire to them and you measure how much energy comes out or how much heat, because heat is energy, you will get less from the ethanol for the same quantity. Um, it On the other side, it has a higher hydrogen content and it has an oxygen content. So the reason why that can be important is that when you think about your road car, and whenever you have it on your driveway and you wash it, do you ever wash the inside of your exhaust pipes just to make them look a little bit shinier? Um, the rag that you're using or the sponge that you're using will always come out really nasty and black, and that soot basically is just carbon, and that is from essentially the incomplete combustion of the fuel in the engine. which then gets then blown out with all the exhaust gases. So the difference with having the ethanol content in there is that you're adding oxygen into the fuel, which then having that oxygen there allows a higher percentage of the combustion of the fuel that is going through the engine. So you're turning it into CO2. So you'll get less carbon deposits because it's being properly burned. So that's where then the efficiency comes into it. And yeah, but the reason though why F1 has made this switch, and it is in line with being more accustomed with road cars and technology that we would have on our driveway, is that E10 E10 has been standard in the UK now for, I think, about 2 years or approaching 2 years. And the idea is that when you produce ethanol, if you can produce it with biomass, then that's considered to be carbon neutral, because biomass is essentially plants which are absorbing that carbon dioxide when they're growing. So then when you're burning it, all you're doing is you're releasing the CO2 which was absorbed when it was a plant. So, I mean, there's a lot of discussions about that at the moment. So there was a study that came out in February this year in the US, suggesting that it's not actually carbon neutral because what was it? The USDA. I want to say. Hold on. Yeah, the USDA, which is the US Department of Agriculture. Basically, what this study suggested is that they didn't take into account the renewing of the land for every time that you're planting it, because obviously you're still driving tractors across it, you're upsetting the soil and whatever else. So there's still a lot of discussion, seemingly, around whether it is truly carbon neutral, or a carbon neutral component to have that ethanol in the fuel. But that's essentially why F1 has gone towards this, is to try and reduce its official carbon footprint.
And just in relation to that as well, John, like from your research, and I know the knowledge that you have as well, is this kind of move towards E10 fuel sustainable? Will we kind of have this for a couple of years? Is it something where it's good for now, but then as standards and obviously rules and regulations change, we might actually go to something maybe more like effective and more efficient? And to caveat that question, do you think we're always going to have like combustion engines in Formula One? Do you think at some stage we might drop like the internal combustion engine completely and maybe just go to electric racing, like what we've seen with Formula E?
Well, no. So, Formula E, Mr. Agag has managed to get exclusivity on electric single-seater racing for a considerable length of time. I can't remember exactly how long, but it's long enough that basically F1 is kind of hamstrung and unable to go in that direction. And again, that's partly why they're looking at having still hybrid systems, and they're looking at different fuel sources instead. There is, for me, I think the way for F1 to go would be to look at hydrogen fuel, because that's something that's not actually been done particularly much. And I do think that ultimately hydrogen would be a better long-term solution for road cars as well than just, pure electric battery celled vehicles. But it's a lagging technology. It's behind the likes of Tesla and these other the other large manufacturers now who've all jumped on board the electric game. And it seems to be only really Toyota who have put serious investment into hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, which of course then they're not taking off because nowhere in the world seems to have any kind of network set up for refilling them.
Sure.
So no, I don't think F1 is going to go fully electric. I think they're probably quite hesitant to go down the hydrogen line, because of how new that technology still is. You know, there's a high likelihood that if you say, right, in 2028, for example, we're gonna move to hydrogen fuel cell, Formula One, and all these manufacturers are going to be scratching their heads, and they'll come out with something, and perhaps most of them will have a peak power output of 20% of what they have at the moment. And if that's the case, people will stop watching, won't they?
Of course, and it's a tricky one, like you mentioned there as well, John, because Formula One, out of all the motorsport disciplines, it's seen as like the one that should be really at the top end, and the most powerful cars, the most kind of innovative cars. So if they're gonna have 20% less power, then that's already kind of a slap in the face. And then also, I think another thing, just thinking about what you're talking there, is like we're trying to encourage more manufacturers to get into Formula One. You've had like a lot of talks recently about the Volkswagen Audi group and Porsche potentially collaborating with Red Bull in the future as well. So I guess if they were to make things even more complicated by adding like a different fuel source, or like changing the rules essentially where we have to use different fuels, then that might put teams or other engine suppliers off from entering the sport. And it's a tricky balance between, like, I guess, fighting for the innovation, but at the same time as well, trying to keep it so it's affordable for lots of manufacturers to take part, and that it doesn't become like a barrier to trade of such. So I agree with you. And then the final thing on the fuel as well, John, because it was interesting, and even for me, like I don't know much about the hydrogen fuel cell kind of movement. What would you say are the advantages of it, or why is it more beneficial, or what are the perks of it compared to other sustainability and fuels?
Well, basically, if you're burning hydrogen, um, the only product of that is water.
Wow.
So whatever comes out the tailpipe, it's think back to I guess maybe your GCSE or high school chemistry lessons.
Mhm,
And you think of it, you've got H2, which is your hydrogen. When you
mhm.
burn anything, it's a reaction with oxygen.
Sure.
So you're just taking H2 and O2, and then you're turning it into 2H2O.
And there's no carbon dioxide that's a byproduct of that either.
None
How?
whatsoever, no, because there's no carbon in the fuel.
Hmm.
So
Okay.
you only get CO2 emissions if you're burning something that has a carbon content,
Mhm.
whether that's wood or oil or petrol or whatever. Um, yeah, it has to have a carbon content for you to then have CO2 going out, which again is just carbon reacting with the oxygen.
That's
Excuse me.
intriguing. No, I mean, thank you for kind of explaining that as well, John. Because yeah, like that would make a lot more sense. And on top of that, I could definitely see now why that would probably be a lot more appealing, and it's probably a nicer kind of alternative compared to maybe just going down the electric route. Because also with that, you lose the sound, the kind of emotion, and kind of passion, I guess, that a lot of people talk about when it comes to V10s and V8s and stuff like that too. So yeah, I think hydrogen may be the way of the future, and hopefully it's something that they could continue to look forward to as time progresses. So that's interesting. But okay, segueing into the next question then. Mercedes have been testing out some different wings. They had one at Bahrain, which seemed to be a lot more bigger and had a much more like shallow kind of inlay. And then towards Saudi Arabia, it literally looked like somebody took a chainsaw and cut off a lot of the top of the surface area. So it's been interesting to see how they've been messing around with different things on the car to maybe perhaps tackle some of the porpoising. And just in general as well, it also appears that Georgina's done some research and is saying that they put an optical sensor weighted at 1.5 kilos during the Australian Grand Prix just to pick up some additional data. And the question really is here, John, is these teams aren't really at a rookie level. They're obviously quite profound in Formula One. But why is it that they're still like struggling to crack the code like so earlier on in the season?
Uh, it's just one of those things when there's a big regulation change. Um, you find yourself designing a car from pretty much a blank sheet of paper, and you will be going into those first tests unsure of the true performance. The data that you can get from CFD and wind tunnels are never truly reflective of the real world. So, for example, in CFD, it's all based on laminar flow and ideal conditions. So it will show you where your areas of turbulence are, and where you'll be getting more drag, more downforce, or whatever else. But it's always based on ideal physical properties. And we know as engineers that in the real world, when we do our calculations, we will always add in safety factors because we know that the world is not an ideal place. Not every time you say fire some water out of your hose pipe, if you replicate it exactly the same in the exact same conditions, you will still get very minor discrepancies, changes between them. And that will be why Mercedes were running that sensor. So I don't think that I wouldn't say that they're failing at all, but I would say that at the moment, especially teams like Mercedes, they're going through a very steep learning process. I think it's quite clear. I think we can all see they've got a car that's got potentially a massive potential. God, I'm good with words, aren't I?
I'm not much better, John.
But that's why I'm an engineer and not a writer. But yeah, I think it's quite clear they've got a car with really good potential, but they've not quite found the way to unlock that potential yet. So imagine yourself working in an office and you've said you're going to go in and do some overtime on Saturday and ask your boss if you can borrow the keys. And he chucks you a set of keys which have got 20 keys on them. None of them are labeled. So when you turn up on the Saturday morning, you go through, and it's always the rule, isn't it, that it ends up being the 19th key out of the 20, which is the one that
Sure.
opens the door. So that's possibly where Mercedes are going at the moment with trying these different wings, trying these different little things. It's some of them are setting them back, and they'll see in their practice sessions, and then they'll revert the car back to what they know if said upgrade or said change has taken them a step back. But again, with the key analogy, you might get lucky first time as well. But if you do, then you're less likely to remember which key it was. And then when you go to lock up at the end of the day, you're then going to have to go through the 20 keys anyway. So teams that may have lucked their way into finding a solution for the porpoising, or just a really nicely balanced car, they could bring upgrades in Spain which completely undo that balance. So Mercedes going through these struggles isn't necessarily a bad thing. We've seen with their cars in the past that they've had what they will even call diva cars, and it's taken them until midway through the season to really unleash the potential and stretch their legs. And I think we're probably going to see the same again this year. I think people who are hoping for Mercedes to be taking wins again before the summer break, I think are very optimistic. Obviously, anything can happen in Formula One, and it usually does, is the famous phrase. But if you think back to, I guess, the 2020 and 2021 Racing Point / Aston Martins, as you've already alluded to, the floor changes that were brought in for 2021 completely nerfed the Aston Martin. And that wasn't the case for Mercedes. They coped because they'd had that philosophy, the low rake setup, for 6 years before. So they'd run that concept for such a long time, and they fully understood it and how to make the most out of it, even with those bits missing. Whereas Aston Martin had kind of Racing Point had kind of stumbled into a really successful season in 2020 by kind of trying to jump on the direction that Mercedes had obviously proven was a good one, but they clearly didn't fully understand that concept as well as Mercedes did. So then in 2021, when it came to logging up at the end of the day, they then had to go through all 20 keys.
Sure.
So from some of the stuff that I've been hearing as well is that Red Bull had put in a few upgrades in the Abu Dhabi testing, which were primarily aimed to stop the porpoising, but gave them a lot more performance benefits than they actually expected, which again alludes to the difference between wind tunnel and CFD data compared with real world running. So again, that's a bit like the key analogy as well, is if they've got into that so quickly, there is a chance. And by no means am I suggesting that Adrian Newey doesn't know what he's doing. He's one of the most successful designers in F1 history. He's a damn sight smarter than I am. But there is a possibility that if they put, say, 3 upgrades on the car, it might be that they all need each other to stay the same, to work effectively. And if you change one of them, doesn't matter which one it is, it could then unbalance the other 2.
Sure.
So if there's any element of luck in them finding that balance, then there is just as much a chance of them undoing it with a future upgrade. So I think Mercedes won't be too worried at the moment. Every time they go out on track, they're learning. The optical sensor, again, is just a perfect example of them making the decision that they want the real world data, and that is their priority. That's what's most important. They can't put up those big aero screens on the car like they were doing in testing, obviously, because that's not really ideal for racing with, and I don't think
Sure.
that would pass the scrutineering. But they can then go back into the factory and compare that data from car 44 with what they're seeing in the CFD simulations and in the wind tunnel. And then with that comparison and being able to spot the differences there, then they would be able to correlate those differences to any new parts and better understand how upgrades are going to affect the car going forward. And that then will give them a better understanding of where the direction that they're going to take this car in. And if they now don't have the upgrades for Imola that they were hoping, that possibly suggests that what they had been doing when they line it up with this new data from the car in Australia, it's not quite where they want to be with it. So they've got a couple little tweaks that they need to do to get the performance out of it that they want. So again, there's no need to panic, no need to stress. These guys are 8 times constructors champions for a reason, and they will work it out. It's just a matter of when, not if.
True, yeah, and I'd absolutely agree with you on that one as well, John. It seems to just be trial and error, and of course, like with such new and vast regulations, it's understandable as to why maybe they might not hit the ground running straight away. But of course, they've got a tremendous amount of resources, they've got the right facilities, they've got all the staff and people there as well. And I'm sure just them not being just at the top right now, it's probably fueling them even more to just continue working as hard as they can to bring those upgrades, and hopefully we will see a change in tune, and hopefully the W13 up where it should be. So yeah, I absolutely agree with you on that as well. So kind of bringing it on to a fan question that we've had in this week. The
No.
basic question that they've had was how important is a track location for a car? And I guess to kind of add some fat to that question too, what traits does the Ferrari car have so far that's made it so competitive in the opening rounds?
Oh, you're chucking a two-parter at me. Right.
Aha,
Okay.
indeed.
Well, the track locations always play a part. You know, there's always going to be cars which are stronger in certain situations. So, for example, you know, in the past few years, we were always able to fairly confidently predict that track X would favor the Mercedes and track Y would favor Red Bull. Obviously, that's a little bit more up in the air at the moment as the cars are so new and so different. But there are already some signs there as to kind of the pros and cons of the different designs and the different philosophies, as evidenced by McLaren finally turning up in Australia, which I was very pleased to see myself. You know, perhaps their car is not so well suited to the fast stuff that we had in Jeddah. Um, and similarly with the Mercedes, you know, if you look at the qualifying performances in Australia in particular, Sector 1, Lewis was setting purples every time. Um, so that car is obviously quite nicely set up for the kind of slow to medium speed stuff where you really need the traction coming out of the corners. So I would say that even in its current guise, that that Mercedes could be a strong car at tracks like Monaco, maybe Singapore, but uh, it's going to be a tough weekend when the F1 circus goes to Silverstone. Um, but then the Red Bull, you can see they're clearly set up for high speed. You know, they've been towards the top in all the speed traps um, pretty much every weekend. Um, and then the Ferrari actually doesn't seem to be a standout car in any one way, but it feels like it's kind of the second or maybe third best car in everything.
Yeah.
And I think that's where their success is coming from. And it seems really weird because it's such a pretty car, and historically, the really pretty cars are always a dud. Always the nicest looking cars at the time end up being towards the back of the grid, and Ferrari seem to have somehow pulled it off. Um, and the impression that I'm getting, or the feeling that I'm getting from watching, is that that car is really nicely balanced, and both of those drivers have got the confidence that they can push really hard in every sector. So it might not be the fastest in every sector, um, won't have the top speed of the Red Bulls, for example. It might not quite have the same traction that maybe the Mercedes will have. But if it's good enough everywhere, you know, it's all about consistency. That and then that will give it the advantage over a full lap and possibly over the full season as well. The way things are looking.
Sure, and yeah, just it's so true that essentially, I guess for each circuit, there's going to be unique kind of traits, as you mentioned as well. And it's funny how over time things change, because it was always Red Bull that had more downforce, and at circuits like Monaco, they would just have a blast. Whereas Mercedes, perhaps with the longer wheelbase, back in the day it wouldn't really suit the more tighter circuits like Monaco, but then obviously the longer wheelbase would help the metro circuits like Suzuka, where you need that stability, and I guess the extra wheelbase length helps the car be more stable through high speed changes of direction as well. And then, like you mentioned as well, the Ferrari is just, it just seems to be the perfect middle child. Like, not to quote Hannah Montana, but it's like the best of both worlds in terms of its like performance, but then also the way it looks as well, because it's such a stunning and elegant car, but also you can see that maybe because Ferrari haven't been at the top fighting for championships for a couple of years, that kind of time they've had in the background, in the back kind of stage, they've just been working on different things. And now, kind of when people weren't so much expecting it, they've come out with, just hitting the ground running essentially. And they've made really huge steps with the car. Because on certain weekends, Leclerc's just seemed unbeatable. And it's not to take away from Leclerc, because he's always been a star driver, and I think one of the drivers for the future. But this new Ferrari, it just gels with his driving style so well. And there are times where I'm like, geez, this guy doesn't seem phased or unhinged at all. He just goes out there and he just makes it seem effortless. But it's anything but. So yeah, so true. And I agree a lot with the things that you touched on there too. So to kind of bring it more to what you do, John, in relation to your work in the automotive industry, where does the mechanical engineering side fit into the F1 field, and what role do you play into the automotive supply industry? I know you touched on this in the intro, but maybe we can go in this in a bit more depth and give you the reins just to explain it a lot more.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, in F1 or in motorsport generally, engineers are everywhere. From the pit wall, even if you're not, say, a degree qualified engineer, if you're sat in Bono's position, or even Jonathan Wheatley's position, you need a good technical grounding to understand what information you're being fed back by the drivers over the radio. In the garage as well, it'll be engineers there who are rebuilding the car or overseeing the setups during the practice sessions and qualifying. In the factory, you'll have people analyzing the race data, which then they can feed into the strategy. So, looking at how the car is performing in certain sectors, looking at the tire data and the degradation and all of that kind of stuff. That's all engineering. And then of course you've got the what people typically think of engineers, which would be designing the components. The guy in the lab coat sat in the little office on the edge of the wind tunnel, watching the fans blow air over the cars. You've got the mechanical testing as well. So each time they design a new car, obviously they have to meet the FIA crash tests and the safety standards. So you'll be having people there who are stress testing parts all year round. Every time that they're putting a new wing on the car, they're going to want to know how it's going to brake, or if it's going to break in certain situations. And similarly, with the flex of the wings as well. So they can make the rear wings as thin and light as they want to. However, as we've seen with those dots on there for the camera to pick it up, if they make those wings too light, they'll be too flexible. So again, it goes back a little bit to that weight saving question at the start. You can make those wings completely hollow just out of carbon fiber. However, then they're going to move around and then they're not going to be compliant. And then also, in engineering as well, you've got writing codes for the engine modes or steering wheel controls. All of that stuff is under the umbrella of engineering. But yeah, from my perspective and my background, it's all been about physical, mechanical properties of stuff. So I was involved in chassis development and testing, and understanding how kind of the chassis would behave under certain load conditions.
Mhm.
Um, So that was, a mix of understanding materials, understanding how um, carbon fiber is layered when it's applied, the directionality of the fibers um, in there as well will make a difference to which direction the the part is strongest in.
Sure.
Um, so, for example, if you have um, if all of the fibers, your carbon fiber compound, if they're all facing in one direction, then it will be very strong in one direction, and then like floppy spaghetti in the other direction. So you need a mix, but depending on what you want from that component, then you can play with your percentage on directionality to make it, say, stronger for a load sat on the top, which might be, say, your downforce on a wing, but then it doesn't need to be as strong in a secondary direction, let's say end plate to end plate.
Sure.
So there's all that, that level of detail, especially when it's at the top level like F1, that literally go down to the minutest level of detail. Um, but then with the wider industry, engineering, for me, I most of my work now in braking products is kind of fixing problems for these high end um, car manufacturers. So they buy um, products from my company, and then if there are any updates to be done, whether that's for part of the life cycle of the vehicle, or if it's got to be changed because the California government has decided that there's a maximum copper content that you can have in a brake pad, or China has decided that there's extra testing required on every component that's manufactured outside of China, even if it's exactly the same, then that's where I come in and I look at the testing requirements, what we do, what we need to do, and then whether our parts will pass all of those testing requirements. And then if they don't, then that's where then I go into the detail and the design side to come up with a solution that will still do the job, um, but now meets those requirements.
Sure. And just kind of staying on the subject as well, John, how would you say your experiences have differed between like the motorsport industry and then like the automotive industry as well? Like, what would you say are the differences in the way that the jobs are, or maybe some of the traits and quirks and just the roles that you have to perform in each kind of division?
Well, top level motorsport isn't for everyone, and I very much include myself in that. It's a very cool thing that I can say that I've been a part of it. I'm very proud of that. But it was not for me, and I was worn out within a year. And I wasn't even doing the traveling that these guys do, from country to country. Um, it's the pressure, the time frames, the stress, the fact that you take your work home with you, and you can sometimes go all night just lying in bed thinking about the issues that you've had with your simulation or your calculations, and what have you done wrong and how can you fix it. Whereas my job now, I would probably be described by a lot of people as being a pretty mediocre engineer these days. Um, but actually, I'm a lot happier with that, because come the end of the day, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, when I shut my laptop, I can just leave that all there, and it's very rare that I'm up at night thinking about a problem.
Sure.
Obviously, if there's a particular safety aspect, then yeah, that can get to me, because safety is always the priority, especially when you're talking about brakes and being able to stop a car. But most of the concerns are just financial stuff, which is between companies, and I can just leave that to the sales guys or the legal guys or whatever to sort out, and I don't need to worry really about those issues. Um, but also I get a lot more variety in my job and my projects. So, like I kind of touched on, I have to cover regulation sides as well as actual performance and the metallurgy or the materials science parts of it. And there's never two projects that are the same. Whereas when you're in top level motorsport, essentially you have to be a specialist. And when you're a specialist, you're expected to work on what you specialize in.
Mhm.
So, okay, there's new regulations, new design of cars, but ultimately, if you are working in the team that does all the suspension last year, you're going to be doing that this year. And for me, having that variety is actually more interesting.
Sure.
And that's not me trying to kind of take anything away from those guys who work at that top level of motorsport. I've tried it and I couldn't do it. I couldn't hack it. So, um, but yeah, I'm not quite sure what to say more on that. To be honest, it's
No, I think you answered the question really well, John, because it's intriguing as well just to get that level of insight and to just see kind of what kind of roles or how the mental approach is, I guess, if you're just like on the motor side of things and it's just a rigid kind of you're expected to do the suspension, for example, this is what it is. And then obviously the pressures, I guess, and demands that come with, next year if the regulations change and something with the suspension happens to be the case as well, then you're immediately expected to kind of be on top of that. Whereas with what you've said in relation to the automotive side, and I think I would probably be one of the more automotive guys too. Just it'd be nice probably to have that flexibility, knowing that you don't have to do the exact same thing day in day out. That there are more kind of, I guess, flexible ways that you can go about doing the job, and also the expectations are different. But still, I imagine it's still being quite challenging, and there are going to be new things that you're faced with, and whether or not it's from the safety side that you touched on, or even just in terms of the legal or kind of financial implications as well of the work that you do, how that affects manufacturers and teams looking to purchase these parts as well. So I think you answered the question spot on there.
Yeah, I
And
mean, for example, as well, sorry, for an example as well, like 2 years ago, I wasn't working on braking products. I was reverse engineering gearboxes.
oh, okay.
So that's, completely different. And you need a completely different skill set to be able to strip down a gearbox and then measure everything up and then create the drawings and then make sure that you're meeting all the standards and that your DIN specifications for all of the bolts that are going to be used and your gear ratios and all of that kind of detail. So that's me staying within the same company, just going to a different role, and
Wow,
it's
okay.
completely different.
That's intriguing, and like we touched on as well, like it's cool that you kind of have that element, and just for the listeners at home, because I know, and that was probably one of the later questions I was going to ask, is it's cool to just know kind of what flexibility you have, kind of what options you have in a job as well, where you're working either with a manufacturer or a team, or this kind of this thing as well in the automotive side of things, and like what opportunities and projects you get to work on, because like you've mentioned there, like just with the same company you've essentially had two completely different roles there. And I imagine that they'll bring you different challenges, and they focus on two completely different components that interact in their own ways. So that's really cool. And I've learned something new there as well. And just in relation to this as well, John, like we're gonna bring it to the fantasy aspect of our show here. So me and Georgina kind of ask some more outlandish or more like just
Oh, go
kind of
on.
personal questions. But from my side, like we've touched on like how cool it is that sometimes you have innovations in motorsport, and then they make their way into like the automotive world where you have like sports cars or hypercars, supercars, that sort of thing. John,
Yeah.
what would you say is like your overall favorite like road car that has some technology or something derived from Formula One. So examples I was gonna give was like the new Mercedes Project One that has literally the same engine or a derived V6 hybrid engine from the Formula One team. I was also thinking along the lines of like the Ferrari Scuderia F430, which had the gearbox developed by Michael Schumacher, but was like a sports car you could buy and drive on the road. And like the last example would probably be like the McLaren P1, which again had like the KERS kind of kinetic energy recovery system from the early kind of 2009, 2010 era, which then also was put in a road hypercar too. So yeah, what was like your dream? What's your dream car overall? And then what like car would you say is your favorite that has some sort of technology derived
Oh
from the
man.
motorsport industry?
Well, that's that's crikey. That's a really difficult one to answer. I'm probably going to sound really, really old school here. Um, I'm probably going to have to go with a Ferrari F50, uh,
Nice.
which is the least loved,
People mostly
because
go for the
everyone,
F40, don't they?
yeah, most people go for the F40, but I would pick the F50 because it's something that you'd be able to live with a little bit nicer.
Mhm.
It's a bit better for every day. But that had tons and tons of F1 tech in there. And one of the things that actually I think has been uh, an under acknowledged, I think is probably the right phrase, um, technology that's gone from F1 to road cars is active differentials.
Ah,
So I can highly recommend. I'm going to do a plug of someone else for a second, but Peter Windsor's um, channel on YouTube,
mhm.
um, and he had a whole episode on it, I think last month, about active differentials, and how they came in at around the same time as active suspension,
Okay.
but they were never banned, because the reason why active suspension was ultimately banned was the cost. That
Mhm.
Ferrari argued it was so expensive, so and they didn't want to copy it or come up with their own. So the FIA, being the FIA at the time, banned it.
Sure.
Um, but the active differential was a fairly easy, quick one to copy, and that these days is in all your high end road cars. You know, even stuff like your AMG Mercedes or your M series BMWs now. Um, it's really revolutionized how cars can handle around corners, um, while under power.
Sure, because I was going to ask you as well, Joe, how does, like, for the lay people at home listening, how does a diff work? Because I know with Mercedes, they've got like a high-speed diff, a mid-entry diff, and then an entry diff, and you can open and close it. And I assume that that probably like interacts with how much slip the car gets or how the torque is transmitted to the axles. But I'll leave it to you to explain because I know you've got more expertise on that.
So essentially, like on a basic level, you've got, let's say, a normal road car. If it's rear wheel drive, you've got your drive shaft running down the middle of the car that then goes into the differential, and the differential then splits it in to a basically a 90-degree angle of rotation,
Mhm.
because obviously you want the wheels to send the car forward, not sideways. Um, Now, how that works is a series of gears. You've got you put a, hold on, I'm forgetting my words with my COVID. Sorry. You've got a gear basically on the end of the drive shaft, and then a larger bevel gear at 90 degrees, which is being turned by the drive shaft. That
Mhm.
then in turn has a little planetary set which is connected to it, which then, based on how much traction you can get through the wheels, um, that those two gears on that little planetary set can move at different speeds. So although you've got a single speed going into the differential, by the way that it works its way around via the bevel gear and then that little planetary set, that's
Mhm.
where you then get, um, your different setup. So you could very easily, like if, for example, if it was a locked diff, all you would have would be the gear on the end of the drive shaft and your bevel gear at 90 degrees. And then, but then both wheels would be turning the exact same amount
At the same time.
at the same, yeah, at the same time, the same amount of power through your whole um, rear axle. So your differential splits that up and allows one wheel that has the traction to drive,
Mhm.
which is why sometimes when you see kids doing burnouts in their Renault Clios in a car park, half the time only one wheel is spinning. So that's
Ah.
kind of how that works.
Interesting. Okay, well, and I like the analogy there as well, man. When we'll go to our McDonald's drive-through and you've got like little chavvy kids in 1.2
It's always a
Clios
McDonald's
doing.
car park.
It really is. It really is. But no, I think even for the people at home, which maybe aren't so technically minded, that's actually a really good example. And I've learned from that too, because even just in the sim, you've got so many different parameters for the diff and whether you want it open, closed, at what speed, whether it's for the entry of a corner or the exit, and all of these things, like as you said, they affect the balance of the car and how much grip the wheels can essentially gain or send throughout the transitionary phases of a corner. So yeah, and just like we touched on as well, it's tech that's come from F1 that now we've seen in road cars, and even the most basic ones have some level of technology like that too. So it's just great to see. And I feel Formula One does get a rap sometimes of just being an expensive, like glorious sport where nothing comes to road cars. But if you really dig below the surface, as we mentioned, there's so many innovations that have come from Formula One cars and now derive in standard, road cars just as standard practice. So whether it's for safety or performance, so I agree with you on that as well. And also Georgie's random question was pretzels or scones?
Oh, that's a good one. I'm going to go with scones. But that,
Ooh.
well, you see, I live in Germany, so pretzels are not that difficult to come by, whereas a scone is like, yeah, unicorn turds. Um, so it's yeah, I'll always go for something that I can't get easily. And I'm going to upset everyone now because it has to be jam on the scone and cream on the top. So
Hey.
sorry, sorry, Devon, but you're just wrong.
And this is a debate that could ramble on forever because I know a lot of people have this. And like the other day, even in the office, we are having this discussion as to whether a Jaffa cake is a cake or a biscuit.
Oh, yeah, because there was a whole legal thing about that because it depends if it's I
I
think
think if it's like a cake
you have to pay a different tax
tax, yeah,
on
that's
it,
it.
depending if it's a cake or a biscuit. Yeah. Um, I don't care if it's a cake or a biscuit.
Likewise.
They can
Oh,
call it what the heck they want to. It doesn't really matter. It's still the same product in the
yeah.
end of the day.
Exactly. This is it. Well, John, it's been amazing to have you on the show. I've taken away so much from this, and I'm sure the viewers would as well. I wanted to get into some predictions. So actually, yeah, let's do the predictions first. So
Go
we're
on.
in Italy. We're going back to Imola. Thoughts on the sprint race? Formula or format being kept, and what are your predictions for quali? And who do you think's gonna win the race in the podium order?
Oh, that's oh man. So I I'm gonna punt that I think Checo's gonna be on the front row. I think the car seems to be really, really quick, and he seems to like the way that it feels in his hands. And he showed us very nicely with his pole position in Saudi,
True.
and he did drive very well to take his second place in Australia. And I think I think it's going to be between Perez and Leclerc for pole.
Mhm.
Um, and probably then again it's going to be Red Bull Ferrari on the second row too. I think Lando Norris showed that he drives very well at Imola last season. He was unlucky. Um, and if McLaren can turn up in the same vein that they did in Australia, then potentially he could put himself in the mix even on the second row if one of the Ferraris or Red Bulls kind of mess up their lap or get a bit unlucky with traffic. I think the sprint race though, I think is going to change that. I think probably Checo will go a little bit backwards. So I would say top three from the sprint race are probably going to be Leclerc, Verstappen, and Sainz. And then in the race on the Sunday, I can see potentially Red Bull having more mechanical issues. So I don't know. Maybe it's going to be a Leclerc, Sainz, Russell podium. Let's go with that. Throw that one out.
Ooh, well, you heard it here first from John himself. Like that's the order, and yeah, I could foresee that as well. It's a really realistic podium, I feel, and also yeah, I agree with the points that you mentioned there about Perez too. It just seems that this car really suits his driving style. It's nice as well that he's picked up like the baton because one of the criticisms he was getting like a lot last year was his qualifying wasn't that great, and then he was really relying on like his tire whispering skills as such to try and kind of get him back up the order, but in relation to this season, he's been there or thereabouts, so you can't knock him at all. And I've been, this is a supporter of him as well. Super happy to see him giving Max a hard time and Red Bull almost like scratching their heads now that they actually have two drivers in the fight that they can use, and obviously to play either one of them in a strategic sense as well. So I absolutely agree with you. And John, like final question I just wanted to ask you, we've got obviously a lot of kids growing up these days in like science, technology, English, maths kind of field backgrounds that one day might wish to have the amazing feats and achievements that you've had, getting to work in both the automotive and motorsport industry as well with your background. What advice would you give to the young grasshoppers as such, that are still in school or probably in uni right now? In terms of getting work experience or in general just following their dream maybe to have the aspirations of doing the sort of work that you do.
Oh, well, first thing I would say is stay off Twitter. Uh, uh, but no, I'd say that get writing to people, go speaking to people. It's honestly the even in 2022, the world is still driven by, well, more by who you know rather than what you know.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, I was lucky to get into F1 because I was essentially recruited by a guy who was my lecturer in my final year at
Ah,
university. So he got snapped by an F1 team and then brought me along. So and
John,
a
by the
couple of
way,
others as
sorry
well.
to interrupt there as well. Like, could you disclose which F1 team it was, or is that under the wraps?
That's under wraps. There were a couple
Okay,
of fairly prominent people I didn't get on with at all. So I'm not going down that route because I don't want to
okay, fair
start
enough.
staring. Sorry,
Fair enough. That's fair.
but
That's fair enough.
no, I would say get speaking to people. Have a look. If you're sort of GCSE A level age, or college, speak to small local engineering firms that manufacture things. Get an idea and an understanding of how things get made and produced, because that will help you at university as well. Having a better understanding of how to make stuff, because you can design the funkiest thing that you think is going to work, but if you can't physically make it, then it's no good.
Sure.
So yeah, get as much experience as you can from there, and then when you're at university, obviously work hard and just send out emails and ask if you can get some experience. If you want to work with an F1 team, drop them an email to their they've all got sort of open inboxes, haven't they, that you can access online, I'm sure. So drop them some emails and ask them if you would be able to go around and visit, experience anything. If there's potential internships, just talk. Don't ever expect um, it to fall in your lap. Obviously, I was extremely lucky that it kind of did for me. So I know that's kind of being a bit hypocritical, but you really have to put in the yards to be able to make that step to where you want to go to.
Makes sense, and like you said as well, I think being in the right place at the right time, just having a bit of ambition and courage as well to just ask the question, will get you like a really long and far way. And it's never too late for anyone if you're out there and you're beyond kind of the university and kind of like degree stage. There's still many opportunities out there, plenty of things advertised by the teams, and you can really see with F1 that it's a growing sport. For the future, there's going to be a lot more roles, going to be a lot more opportunities, a lot more work for people. And in that regard as well, if you can set yourself up from an early stage, as John's advised here, then you put yourself in a really great position to take those opportunities and to make the most of them as well. So I absolutely agree with you on that. And John as well, it's just been a pleasure to have you on today as well. I actually had like my little notepad, like my little Ted Kravitz notepad on the side, just writing some stuff down as well. And it's got pages that are filled up. So I really appreciate your time as well, John. And also just a big shout out to you. And if our viewers at home they would like to contact you or they want to find out about like projects that you're working on or they wanted to work alongside you maybe one day in the future, where can they find you?
So I'm on Twitter as the Angry Engineer. That's pretty much it, to be honest. I don't really do much social media. Don't really have time for it. So yeah, my inbox is usually open if there's anyone who has any questions, or just send a tweet at me, and I'm normally going to see it.
Excellent. Well, that's great, and John, it's a pleasure. I mean, Georgina, we definitely have to get John back on later on in the season as well, as we see a lot more developments take place and probably some more trends and kind of things that we can comment on as well. But for now, it's just been a great experience to have you on as well, John. I'm so thankful for your time. And for all the listeners there too, I hope that you have a great week. It's race week, but I'm sure you already know that and probably been bombarded with loads of PR messages on Twitter from the various platforms shouting that out. But as always, thank you, John, for being on the platform with us today. It's been great. And as always, huge shout out to everybody out there. And until next time, we will catch you all soon. And for me
Thank
and
you for having me.
Georgie, thank you for being part of it with us as well, John. We appreciate it. And yeah, to everyone out there listening, we hope you have a great day. Any questions, feel free to pop us a message. You also know where to find John. Angry. By the way, why are you so angry, man? Like, why is it the angry engineer?
Oh, just a lot of things that maybe I shouldn't go into on a podcast about that one.
Maybe we'll have to have a separate episode.
Yeah,
Oh,
if you want to branch out into political podcasting or something like that, then I can spend an hour with you as well.
hey, well, listen, I'm definitely sure Georgina will want to expand in those fields fairly soon. So I wouldn't write that off at all. But as always, John, thank you. And yeah, everyone out there, have a great week. And we shall catch you for another episode soon. Until then, peace.